The opinions expressed in this recording are those of the guest and are not those of their past, current, or future employers. Welcome, everyone. My name is Manuel Martinez, and this is another episode of Career Downloads, where each episode I bring on a different guest to really learn more about their background and their experience, to try and gain any actionable advice that you can use as you're managing your own career. I have with me Andrew Ferrall, and this is a pretty interesting conversation. So back when I first started the podcast and was looking for guests, I really just started looking on LinkedIn to try and find people that were local to the area that had a career trajectory that looked like, there's promotions, maybe they had moved around, just something where I thought, would bring about interesting conversation. We reached out to him and, had a little bit of back and forth. And eventually we were able to kind of get the scheduling worked out. So I'm really excited. One of the benefits of, again, doing this is getting to know somebody local and kind of know more about them. So with that, I'll go ahead and introduce Andrew.
Hey, thanks for having me, Manuel. Really appreciate you. You've had a lot of awesome guests on your podcast, and I just want to say, it's flattering that you've invited me to kind of be on here. I've learned a lot listening to some of the insights that your other guests have had, and I hope I can bring the same for your audience today.
I think so, and I appreciate you kind of coming on, and you mentioned listening. We did have conversations offline about some of these people, and the other cool thing is I think one of the benefits for me, right? And again, I do this to try and help share information for others, but then I get to meet local people, and again, through the conversations we've had, we found common ground. We were both, Dodger fans, so that kind of helped connect us. And I think it really does a good job of, through this medium and help people understand that, like, we're just people, right? Like, yes, we have a career. Yes, we can learn from each other, but at the same time, like, I can call you up and be like, oh, did you watch the game last night? Did you hear about this?
Yeah.
So that's part of the fun thing for me. So again, it's not just, oh my gosh, it's not just your title, but who you are as a person, that I think I really try to kind of pick my guests based on that.
Yeah.
So if you can tell people who don't know who you are, kind of what your current role or position is, and then kind of some of the responsibilities that, you do. I don't need your day-to-day stuff, but just kind of a general sense of it.
Yeah, so I am the IT security architect for the Las Vegas Raiders football team here in Las Vegas. And I'm kind of the lead person when it comes to cybersecurity initiatives, whether it be day-to-day, defense, compliance, evaluating new initiatives, making sure they're secure and okay to roll out, and really just making sure we're playing our best defense on the cyber gridiron, if you will. So yeah, really awesome. Work with a great team. I rely on a lot of folks that are, more subject matter experts in different parts of IT, specifically networking or even, certain system stuff that I may have not have much expertise on, in my upbringing. And it's a really, really cool job. And it's definitely one that I don't take for granted.
So I'm excited now because, you and I have talked in the past, and I kind of know a little bit of kind of what you do now, but really understanding kind of where you started and kind of what got you there. So if you don't mind telling me or telling us a little bit about, kind of where you grew up, what kind of sparked that interest in technology, and, eventually what you decided, or at least what you thought your career was going to start with, right? Because maybe you thought like, oh, I'm going to be in IT from the get-go, or, like, hey, I'm going to be a firefighter, and kind of pivoted that way.
Yeah. So I actually am lucky enough that, late middle school, early on in high school, I kind of found out I was into technology and potentially wanted to have some sort of career in it. Back in 8th grade, I had a friend who was like really into building computers. He'd build computers, for playing video games. I think Half-Life and Counter-Strike were the big games at the time. Like everyone at that time, this is like early 2000s, late 90s. Everyone's getting their first computer in their home, and AOL was the thing, and you get your disc in the mail and all that good stuff. So we had a family computer, and I would tinker with it, try to find ways to make it better. Sometimes I would break things, and it would be at the time where I wasn't supposed to be using the computer. So I was like, all right, better fix this, before I get in trouble, right. Like double trouble, breaking the computer and, not being on there when you're not supposed to. So I kind of just was starting to pick up like, different skills with computers at that time. There was also a TV channel at the time called Tech TV, if you remember.
I do.
Screensavers, Call for Help. And so I would love like watching that show and learning about different things, different technologies, whether it was, personal computers or gaming or just, different technologies out there. Like MP3 players were coming onto the scene, and, learning about those things. And so as that progression went on over a couple of years of those different things in my life around computers, I kind of decided, I was like, all right, I know when I grow up, I'm going to want to, I didn't know exactly what it was going to be, what it would manifest into, what I would be doing for 8 hours a day. I thought I was going to go work for Microsoft or something, who knows, right? But I knew like when I go to college, because I knew for sure I wanted to go to college, I knew that I was going to want to major in something that was going to lead to some sort of career in working. At the time, I probably thought computers, but overall technology. So,
and similar to you, we had the family computer, and I didn't think about it at the time, or I hadn't remembered it until now you mentioned it. Like we had set hours, right? And afterwards, like I would be using it because there's times where I had homework and I was kind of staying up late, and they're like, "Hey, finish that and then be done." And sure, sometimes I might have taken a break and started playing around with it and then broken it. For the process that you did of kind of like troubleshooting, right? Because sure, I remember Tech TV, and you could watch that and probably pick up some things, but like, how did you? Well, one, your computer's broken, right? And we didn't have cell phones, so it's not like you can be like, well, let me Google this real quick, or let me, pull up a YouTube video on how to fix this. So, like, what's the approach that you would take at that time?
Yeah, so I think back then, first thing was phone a friend. My friend was new to me. He knew everything about computers, right? So I was like, hey, I got this weird thing going on. May have deleted this system file that shouldn't have been deleted. What do you think? Or hey, my computer's just running slow. What are some easy things? So, I'd ask him. But of course, I would learn eventually, like, hey, he doesn't have the answer to everything. Also, he's got like Counter-Strike to go play or something. Yeah, he's busy. So I would turn to, the internet, right? And kind of what we do nowadays, like get on the search engine, look around, and just kind of pool all your different resources between your friend, people and also the internet.
And I think that's it's a good skill to have, and I think at the time we don't realize it, right? But it's again, building a network, like having people who know, and you said it at the very beginning, right? Like I rely on network engineers, on other people who have specialties that I don't, and I'm sure, like you said, they have, he's got games to play, but you start to pick up enough knowledge to where you're like, okay, well, I don't know the answer, but I know what to Google now, or I know how to explain, the problem that I'm having.
I think a huge thing that I picked up along the way was like, what is the problem I'm trying to solve?
Okay.
What is the thing that is actually broken here? Is it that I did delete the system file and the computer needed that file to operate, or was that a shortcut that was pointing to something that you deleted that program so the shortcut's there? Stuff like that. And, I see that in my day to day too sometimes. Like, I'll run into something. I'm like, okay, well, what do I think is actually broken here? I see the result. I see what isn't happening. But where is the kind of the root cause, right? What are the potential options? And, kind of peel the onion back that way. And yeah, I think kind of going through that back then, I think in a weird way, unexpected way, really set me up for where I am today in some ways.
So then you had set on, hey, I want to go to college. I want to do something within here. But again, similar to you, like probably like, I don't know, but I just know that I like technology. It's cool. It seems to be easy. And, that for me, what I liked was, the constant, like it was always changing, right? Like I remember upgrading from Windows 95 to 98, like just even that. And I was like, you run into problems like, okay, ooh, now it's different. Like, and I would poke around to figure out like what's new. So that's what attracted me. So then was it really just, I like technology, and kind of when you got into college, what did you think you were going to do?
Yeah. So I think I originally, probably because it was like the only degree I knew that had to do with technology, I set on like to go into computer science, and that seemed like the obvious choice. And my senior year, I went to UNLV. So my senior year, I was meeting with an advisor at the College of Engineering at UNLV, and I kind of told her like, yeah, I want to do computer science, and she looked at where I was with the prereqs and whatnot, and I kind of told her what I wanted to do, and she's like, I think you should look into this business management information systems major at the business college on campus at UNLV. So, and I was like, okay, I've never heard of that. What is that? And, I saw that, it was like half your core classes are business classes, the other half are technology. And I started thinking about like, this might be actually something that might be worthwhile because there's way more breadth of different things you can learn. And then I also had a friend that I was going to high school with who was going to University of Nevada, Reno, and he was doing the same degree. And I talked to him about it, and he actually knew about it a little bit more than me. And he was like, "You want to go into this because you'll actually learn about the business, computer science. If you want to like go deep into programming and just code all day and maybe build some robots, all kinds of things you can do with computer science. But you're kind of in an isolated, like it's its own specialty. Where if you go with this management information systems major, you're going to learn about different things about business and how technology applies, and give yourself maybe some more options." And so I thought about it and was like, okay, this actually makes a lot more sense here. Because before that, I was like, business. Who cares about business? Why do I want, that sounds boring. Show up to work with suit and tie every day, and obviously, no offense to that. Definitely, if I had a job that I had to do that today, I would have no problem doing that. But at the time in high school, you're like, yeah, there was no appeal, no draw. You're just, I want to play with computers all day. So yeah, once I learned about that, that's how I landed on that. And yeah, I'm super grateful that for my career, that I made that decision, because I feel like it's opened all kinds of paths that I would have never expected.
Kind of looking back, and it looks like you and I are having similar career paths, which is kind of cool, to understand that I didn't also think, similar. I was going to be a computer science major and then switch to MIS, and same thing. I had people that go like, "Hey, why don't you check this out? This sounds like it might be more kind of up your alley." And again, it's one of the benefits of this is understanding that there are similarities, but there are also going to be differences. So then now you move into MIS and you're like, okay, you're starting to get a little bit of this business knowledge. Now at the time you don't realize, not that you become an expert in all the things, but I think you become exposed to it, right?
Right.
They expose you to accounting, to finance, to, business administration. Like there's all these other things that at the same time you're like, it's not what I want to do. I want to do tech and PCs.
Yeah.
But then, how did you How did you do in those other classes? And did you take that seriously enough, or did they explain it as you start taking those classes that you're not taking this because you're going to run the finance department, but it's more so that you have an understanding, like you said, to kind of, now looking back, I'm solving business problems. Well, that's the business problems. I'm just doing it with, different technologies on the back end.
Yeah, I actually, looking back on it, in some ways enjoyed the business classes more than the technology classes because it was just all new stuff to me. And like you really learn, even though it was in the context of a controlled environment, a textbook, and a classroom, you learn how the world functions and why businesses exist and how they operate and like you basically gain the definition of business where like before it was just like a word, so and that really like set me up, I feel like, in my career, because when I went into my first role, I realized like every little thing I did had an impact on the business, minor or major, depending on what I was doing at the time. So I really enjoyed those classes. I definitely enjoyed the tech classes. In some way, the tech classes were more challenging, but so were the business classes. Like I'm like, why accounting and ecom are not my favorite classes at the time, but I really enjoyed it, and I think when I speak to some of my mentees that I've worked with over the last couple of years, and they're asking like, hey, what should I look into if I go to college, or enhance my my breadth of knowledge of things. Like sometimes I say, hey, maybe go take a business class or look into a tech major. Like if you're going to a college that doesn't have any sort of technical program, or they just have technical electives but no program, latch on into business classes, because that's really what technology is affording, is businesses to operate.
So then you mentioned you got into your first role, and what was that process like for you going from college to getting that first role? Because I don't know if it's similar to me. I thought I have a degree. People are going to be like, let's snatch this guy up before somebody else does, and that was not the case.
Yeah. So luckily, timing wise, I wouldn't say it's luck, but it's just the timing of it. While I was in college, I graduated in 2012, so the recession was most of my time in college. So I knew coming out of school, having a job or getting a job wasn't going to be a given. So what I did while I was in school kind of, I think, set me up. The first thing was um, finding some sort of job or internship. Luckily, it was a job because it paid. Finding a job that actually dealt with technology. Going into college, like my only tech experience was helping friends with their computers or classmates, and projects from some of my information systems classes. Other than that, no real concrete experience, right? So I ended up finding a student job on campus with the IT department at UNLV, and that was kind of my first exposure to working in an IT department, like and having something on my resume that says, "Hey, I got some hands-on experience." So that was like the first thing that set me up. The second thing that set me up was we had this club called the Information Systems Society, Management Information Systems Society, and it was basically a networking group of management information systems students, the undergrad program and the graduate program, and we would meet up. It was a couple times a semester, and not only would we meet up, but sometimes we would get some exposure to different businesses that would come in and present to us, or they'd bring us in and show us a data center. And through that, I was actually able to meet someone at my future first job at a dinner that we had, because they would have this annual dinner. and he was able to tell me about some positions they had at the company, referred me, which I'm extremely grateful because he didn't know me. He knew me from, the 30 minutes of conversation we had. And he was able to, say, hey, these are some positions you might be able to at least apply for, coming out of college. And so between the on-campus job as a student, the networking at the Information System Society, and then just, doing all the other things they tell you when you're coming out, like looking for jobs, I was able to land my first job that way. But it was a little scary coming out. You never know. Like, you come in with this promise of, like, I think I remember, like, a little tidbit on the business school's website about the information systems majors, like, the median salary for graduates is 70 grand coming out. I'm like, that sounds great. And then by the time I finished that, I'm like, there's no way anyone's hired me for 70 grand a year. So yeah. But I when I look back at that, like, and I try to reinforce this when people ask me advice, it's like, you gotta get experience where you can. You have to network, and you have to be able to not be afraid to take shots.
And that's a big thing right there, right? Is one, don't be afraid to, like, again, take the shot and go through and try and make apply and find out. And then you said it, the person that you had that dinner with, they at least made you aware, right? Like, he referred you, which, sure, it does help to have a referral, but at the end of the day, it's really based on you, right? Like, you still have to kind of go through an interview and, put your resume together and do that. But those conversations, like you said, it's a 30-minute conversation, but maybe even just that, and, just telling people, like, what it is that you do. And you're like, hey, I'm going through my MIS degree, and just having a conversation with somebody, he was able and had the knowledge to say, hey, well, this might be a good path. And again, it's not, even if he didn't refer you, I think a lot of times people think that, okay, I need to go network so that this person gets me the job, but they just might make you aware of a role that fits the skill set you have at that time.
I never had heard of that company until I met him. Like, I would have never known, like, hey, I should go see if this company's got, openings for IT. I mean, frankly, in some ways, I didn't even know what position I should have been applying for coming out of college. Yeah. And I definitely saw that with some of my classmates going through the program. Like, there were definitely, especially the ones that kind of just maybe found the major because they heard it would be good money. Some people had no idea, like, where they'd start. Some people, like, overshot, thought, hey, I'm gonna just walk in and say, hey, let me run your IT department. And some people just had no idea. So yeah, just talking to people, and learning about what they do or where they work, especially that was like pre-LinkedIn era, right? So you have no idea sometimes. You're blind. You only know what you know.
So then once you get in, you apply, and did he provide you kind of any guidance, or do you remember, like, through, like, college, like, how to prepare your resume and how to, like, the interview, right? Because it's one thing they look at the resume, and there, back then it wasn't so automated, right? Where it would scan for keywords, right? So you're just like,
yeah.
Okay. And, you have at that point, like, one experience in college, right? So they weren't really scrutinizing your resume. It was more, the job interview process. So, starting out, what was the way that you prepared for that, and kind of what did you learn from that, kind of moving forward for future, interviews?
Yeah. So he definitely helped get my resume into, the upper part of the pile, if you will. So I was able to get an HR screening and kind of interview my way through. But what helped me prepare was, on campus they had a career center. So, you can go in and do mock interviews. They look at your resume, and that's kind of where I started learning, like, hey, like, they looked at the job description, they looked at my resume, and they're like, here are things you can highlight on your resume or craft a certain way that will help, stick out. So if he does get that to the top of the pile for you, the HR person then looks at it and goes, okay, this might be a decent fit. And the interview stuff was probably, you can never practice enough. Like you just can't. So going through those rounds, and I was still nervous like crazy. These are my first ever, professional interviews. But going through that and working with somebody and, getting that feedback was really helpful in getting me there. So.
And then now you start this role, and I'm going to assume, I'm trying to remember, but it was more entry level, right? Like PC support kind of type of work, and which at the time like is good, right? Like I've got to start getting the experience. But how long did it take for you? And again, for those that are interested, like you can kind of go through on your LinkedIn and see like that progression. But I'm just curious, you get into this entry level, and again, there's no right or wrong, but for you, what is it that when you started doing that role said, hey, I think I want to do more? Or maybe you didn't, and I've talked to some people where they get so good at it, they're like, well, why don't you try this? Was it more you pushing yourself, or did you kind of have people to kind of guide you and say, hey, you can do more?
So I gotta be honest, I went from a very focused job at UNLV as a student worker. It was probably as a student worker. UNLV, I was on the desktop deployment team. So our team was basically swapping out desktops, going through the process, taking the computer that's at the desk, getting all the data off of it, getting on the new computer. You prep the new computer ahead of bringing it to the desk, basic, very focused role, but important role, especially for a campus the size of UNLV. I went from that to my first job, the company was called Shuffle Master at the time, felt like drinking out of a fire hose. So we had a 9-person team. I want to say it was like 1,000 employees, most of them in Vegas, but a lot of remote. So I basically went from like, hey, you're doing this very focused thing to, okay, there's account lockouts, there's CEO needs help with his MacBook, his Outlook isn't working. I've never used Outlook before. How's this work? There's this service tech in the middle of the country, his BlackBerry email, I think we used Bez at the time, wasn't working, so I had to learn a lot quick. And at first, I think my first couple months, it was like, oh man, do I want to do this? And then also like what was really revealing was like, so these IT departments so huge, right? You just don't even realize as a student the different parts of IT. Like if you never interact with them, you don't know they exist. At Shuffle Master, we had a tech apps team, we had a business apps team, a DBA, network operations manager. So I was able to learn like, oh wow, there's this other part of IT, and it's my job to triage things first before it gets to them. So it was like a really eye-opening experience, and then also like a kind of like splash of cold water, like, hey, this is the real world now. And so as I got more comfortable, started getting better at things, learning when to ask, when to, not be afraid to break things, because when you come into a new job, right, you don't want to just start pulling cables and, deleting, right-clicking, deleting. Once I kind of got that comfort, I think I started finding my groove, and then I started realizing, okay, this is kind of what I wanted to go into, and then, you start working with different people in different departments, and then, you realize like, oh, this is why I took all these business classes, because this business has a finance department, they have an accounting department, they have a legal department, they have an executive team, there's all these different things. There's a support organization. And so that's where it all started clicking for me, and realizing why I had gone through that 5 years of studying, and then getting that basic experience at UNLV to kind of at least set me up with something when I'm walking in with some sort of understanding of things.
And it sounds like we have a little bit of a different experience, at least kind of getting started. Like it's just, you had a smaller team. It wasn't like it's structured. And I don't know, like you're onboarding and as you're drinking, because it's similar to you, right? There's all this information, like you think, oh, I learned all this stuff in textbooks, but that's not the case, right? That's not the real world. But I was fortunate enough. So like I started in gaming. I got pretty lucky in the way that I've got in there. Again, it's just knowing people and, having someone say, hey, there's a role here for help desk and then PC technician. But I had people there that kind of, I don't want to say they were mentors, but like I look at them now as mentees, but they had somebody that you would kind of shadow and kind of train you, right? So more like a training type program. Did you have something similar there? But it sounds like with that small of a team, and being comfortable asking questions. Like for me, day one, they were like, hey, if you have a question, ask. Like we're here to guide you. Did you have that? And did you feel comfortable using that right away? Because sometimes you're like, yeah, I feel like I need to earn, kind of my stripes or, my knowledge so that when I come with a question, it's not a dumb question.
Yeah, I definitely had that in direct and indirect ways. I had, other people on the team that were adjacent to me, they hear me on the phone and they might stop by and they say, hey, you might want to take a look at this, or, hey, there's this thing going on, or hey, here's how you should go about this. And then when it came to asking questions, there was always an open door policy, when it came to asking questions, but I think I had to learn to I think my early days at that job, when something was really broken and I wasn't sure, I was afraid to hold up resolution, right? So I'd like run to my boss's boss, because my boss's boss was like right behind my cube. So sometimes I just like, hey, there's this thing happening, everything's on fire. And she's like, calm down. What steps have you done? And, and through that, I realized like, hey, I got permission here to kind of try some things out, figure it out, learn about it. And in that way, I also learned like, hey, I have to actually try these things. So that way, when I do come to these folks, I have something they can work with. They don't have to start at the bottom of the problem. And so that was, I think, a good balance of like, hey, ask questions, but also like for your own betterment too, learning, try these things out first, and then not everything's a fire,
right.
So.
and then not learning that everything's a fire. And then, like we mentioned, your friend, like, hey, not everybody's going to have the answers, and asking these questions, the question asking to kind of find out the root problem, like you touched on it before, right? Like, hey, I deleted this file. Like, is this a shortcut? Is this a problem? Like, is it there that you're also starting to learn how to ask better questions and communicate, right? Because there's other teams of people, and I think a lot of times we think that like, oh, it's just technical knowledge. Like you said it already, like there's other people, but how did you start to develop or think to yourself like, hey, I've done these steps, or just asking better questions? Like I started on the help desk, and that's where the question asking started for me, is because I can't see, right? I can't say, well, show me. That doesn't work. So I have to ask questions. And the first couple of times, like similar to you, I'd had some people like, hey, well, why don't you ask them X, Y, and Z? Like they could hear what I'm asking. Like, bro, they're, like, is the screen on? Ask them which button they touched on the screen, right? Because a lot of times like, oh, turn the computer on and off again. Okay, yeah, the screen's black now. Okay. Is it coming back up? Like, no, all right, hit the button. And just learning to ask the question, like to find out, like all they were doing was turning the monitor on and off. They weren't rebooting the PC. Like I was telling them hard reboot the PC, but the questions I was asking or the way that I was giving them information, just, we kept doing this.
Yeah, so I think one thing that I was learning was learning your customers, your user base, and their understanding of certain technologies. Like you can talk to someone in finance and they're in the ERP all day, and that's like all they know. That's because that's what they do 8 hours a day. And then if you're talking to a service tech, like they might be an expert at product that they're repairing out in the field, but then when it comes to corporate technology, you got to really walk them through it. So I think learning your customers, learning challenges they may have, and also the environment in general, that kind of stuff, our architecture, different things different people have to do based on where they're at and their roles and how we may configure their stuff to make their stuff work. I think that's where I kind of learned how to build up that information ahead of time whenever I had to escalate, and make sure I eliminated everything I could in my tool belt, before having to, unless it was like obviously certain situations are like, all right, we don't got time, we got to bring this up, but yeah, I think it was really about just not giving up. Kind of like, when with breaking your computer as a kid, like, you better fix this, man. Like, you got to get this going. So trying to figure out everything you can before, you completely bail on an issue, because everything can be solved eventually. Or it might not be completely fixed, but it can be mitigated. So.
And then, I'm trying to remember. So within that role, you did kind of get a couple promotions within there, right?
So that specific role, and this is where I learned about how mergers and acquisitions work.
Okay.
That specific role, so we were acquired by a bigger gaming manufacturing company, and I think I was coming up about 2 years after 2 years of working there by the time it closed. And I decided that I had to pivot at that time. So my title changed, but it wasn't really a promotion, and it was an interesting experience. It was went from a smaller IT team, that at times we ran very lean, to kind of like not quite the size of UNLV's IT department, but to a bigger like department, different parts of IT that you may not work with, because there's layers between you. So yeah, I didn't stick around for a promotion. I decided that the environment for me at the time was, I think I needed to go. I felt like my career was slowing at that pace. We were going through the stresses of a merger and acquisition. You're seeing colleagues leave, get new managers. You're not sure where your promotion, ladder is there, like, how am I going to navigate here? And so I decided at that time to kind of move out.
And then did you feel comfortable enough then, like, hey, I have two years of experience now, like working kind of a little bit more. So at least you felt a little bit more comfortable, like, maybe I'm not going to get a promotion, but at least I know I can make a lateral move to something similar.
I was definitely at that position in my career where I was like, okay, I can try to move up or laterally move and have the opportunity to move up, because I built up the 2 years. Like, I was really proud of like the different things we did. We did a building move. We did, all kinds of projects. We'd moved from BlackBerry to iPhone, which at the time seemed massive. Like, now it's like iPhones are so natural, like naturally placed in the environment. So I in my mind, in looking at my resume on paper, things that I've done, I felt like I was comfortable. I could go into an environment and the Firehose would be a little bit smaller. The flow would be a little more, at a pace I can consume it. And yeah, so I ended up making a lateral move because it was the best position out at the time, and that's what I did. Yeah.
And then talking through those, you mentioned, you felt comfortable with the resume that you had kind of built. The Career Center, where they kind of helped you, like, hey, highlight that. Is that kind of, looking back now, is that what kind of made you think like, oh, well, here's the things that I've done? Like, like you said, if I put this down on paper, like here's everything I've accomplished. Well, if I highlight this and, if I pull this kind of story out and, if they ask me for a situation, like I have the stories to tell in an interview or, even just networking to somebody else, like, hey, this is what I've done, or here's what I know how to do, is that kind of like slowly building that confidence to kind of go through and say, well.
Exactly. I went from like, okay, how do I stretch what I have on my college experience to, hey, I actually got some concrete things I've done. And also like talking to some of my colleagues that I worked with at the time who had already left, but you know, we were still in touch and they were kind of mentors, if you will. They said, hey, like in your mind, you're just a support person, but like you're also kind of running projects. You're helping the business with certain initiatives. Like you can tell a story here and show the impact you made, not just, I closed XYZ tickets and so many account lockouts and on call once a month, so I kind of learned that in that experience and brought in with what I learned from the career center too, like how to any job you apply for, you have to present how you can fit into that. And the best way to do that is you got to tailor your resume and also be able to, if you get the interview, show how you can use those skills.
And when you said kind of look at it on paper, are you the kind of person that goes and like writes things down, like projects now, or kind of even during that time? Because I know some people that are really good at that. I'm not. I try to get better at like, oh, here's the project, and just as much as I think I'll remember it in the future, that's not always the case.
So I've actually been neglecting that a little bit, but over the years, up until my recent job, I would, anytime I did a big project, I'd I try to I would make it a habit, like maybe once a year, twice a year, go to my existing resume and just kind of add some things. Nowadays, you might do it on LinkedIn too, right? Like, and you kind of just have that running thing. But then, yeah, with the projects, sometimes I found going there and writing those things down, no matter how significant the project, was helpful when it came time to actually, if I was looking, or an opportunity came across my lap that someone wanted me to consider, like it was helpful to go there and say, hey, would this look really good for that position, or could this really highlight some things? And I'm kind of a fan of resumes, that do highlight some of those things, because that really tells the story.
Right.
You can put all your skills down and put some metrics down, but like when you're working in the real life job, it's way more than that.
Right. And I think you bring up a great point, is learning how to kind of tell that story and have that information. And back in the day, right, my first couple resumes were like, to your point, right, PC repair, printer, blah 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 blah, like, and you listed out skills instead of highlighting it and telling it as a story and going through. And one of the things that I've learned, especially the last couple of years, is even if you're not looking to move, like you said, hey, I'm comfortable with still kind of updating that resume, because it could be helpful for a promotion, right? To having those stories and say, hey, look, they may be aware, because that was something that I had someone tell me is, yes, your boss knows your job, but they may not be the person that looking at it, or they may not be the only one, and you're not their only, their only direct report. They might have 5, 10. They're not going to remember everything, or they might mix them up. So you kind of have to go through and say, here's what I've done. Here's why I deserve a raise, a promotion, or just, maybe a bonus. Like, who knows what it could be.
And titles mean different things to everybody, right? So sometimes you could have like a lower title, but you're doing senior level work and you're running things, and when you decide to apply for a job that has a title, you might be afraid to apply for it because like, oh man, look at that title. But then you look at what you actually did and you convey that, and the future or prospective employer might look at that and say, oh wow, this guy actually did do this stuff that we're looking for. It's not just, what his title conveyed.
So then at one point in your career, I saw that you were kind of like a systems technician, and a lot of times a lot of what you're doing is that, right? It's like that general breadth of knowledge.
Yeah.
And then you kind of go into like more of like a systems admin, systems administrator. Is that just you continuing to build your skill set and say, hey, I want to move up to this next level? Like, what is it that kind of drove you to kind of continue to move up? Everybody's different. Like some people, it's like, man, I wanted to make more money, or I wanted the title, or like.
Yeah. So I knew, after I'd been doing the support thing for a couple of years, like systems admin was probably my next logical step. At the time, networks was just, I knew I didn't want to do that. I needed to know enough to operate, and be able to talk to a network person, but I knew I didn't want to be a network engineer or anything like that. So systems was kind of something I targeted. And, I had the opportunity to work with my first job's VP of IT. After the acquisition, he was out and he decided to go start an MSP. So shortly after I made that lateral move out of the company, I basically took on another desktop support job. Shortly after that, conveniently, I didn't take this desktop job to only be there for a couple of months, but it just worked out that 3 months into that job, my former VP of IT had started this MSP, and he invited me to come join his MSP and work with another colleague of mine that we all worked at the same company. And so I was like, well, I don't know if this is going to get me to a sysadmin job, but I'm kind of this current desktop job is a little too easy. It was secure. It was great. Like I was had great benefits, way less stressful, and all the good stuff. But I was like sitting there going, okay, I could sit here, do this desktop job, don't know where I can end up here, how many years I gotta wait, before that next step comes, or I can go try this MSP thing. I'm early enough in my career. It's only gonna benefit me. And so I made the hop there, and that was like awesome, doing jack of all trades things, working with different businesses. We worked with, we had a mall management company we worked with. We had some bar and tavern owners. Someone had a coffee shop downtown. So you just go in these different environments and get your hands in different things. Some stuff more traditional corporate IT, some stuff as simple as like, hey, we need good Wi-Fi in our place. What can you help us out with? Or hey, we need to go spin up an Office 365 subscription. We have no idea how to do it. Or hey, we want to stop using GoDaddy email and want to migrate to Exchange. So I started getting all kinds of different skills that I just don't think I would have gotten exposed to. And one of our customers, who was also a gaming manufacturing company, hired us on to do support, is actually kind of what brought me into that role. I ended up getting some exposure with them. My manager at the time ended up going there, and then maybe a year later, they had an opening for sysadmin, and that was my entry way into becoming a sysadmin, which was kind of my logical next step. And that was kind of like, I think, a combination of having those different exposures, even though and just being able to troubleshoot different things and take everything on, and also having kind of the theme is networking again, right? Like having someone who said, "Hey, I've worked with Andrew, and he's also familiar with our environment because he was at the MSP that supported us, and you know, we can go hire a seasoned sysadmin, and they might not work out, or we can give Andrew a shot and let him grow into the position." And that's kind of how I landed there.
Twice now, or almost kind of like three times, you mentioned like the people that you worked with and kind of knowing somebody. Is it your, like, what is it that you think about you specifically that these people kind of called out to, right? Now, we will never know. I mean, unless you go and decide to ask them and say, hey, was I the first choice or was I the 10th choice? And in this situation, I don't think it matters, because even if you were like the 10th choice, like you were a choice, you could have been the 11th, and the 11th, they could have been like, I don't want, I've worked with Andrew and I don't want to work with Andrew. But, is it your constant, like, what are you doing in these roles? Is it just learning and having the exposure and saying, okay, hey, I can learn, I work well with other people. Like, what do you think really kind of helps set you apart for these people to want to go through and say, hey, I'm over here. I vouch for this, I vouch for Andrew because I've worked with him, as opposed to like, hey, yeah, there's a role over there. Maybe you want to apply, but I'm not going to bring you with me.
I think looking back at it was probably, for one, I think it's work ethic. I'll do I'll do a lot of work that is part of my role, and then sometimes outside my role. Troubleshooting. I really, sometimes I get it too far in the weeds of troubleshooting. Sometimes I'll get hooked on an issue and I'm like, I'm gonna figure this out. Like, but I think it was also just building trust with those people that have brought me along the way. My manager that brought me into that role, this was like the third job I've worked with her. So, and she saw me come up from a support person, who was, running into her office saying, "Hey, everything's on fire. I don't know what to do," to like, "Hey, he really does his homework. He, can triage things. He knows when to escalate, when to not, and we know he can pick up. He can pick up things." And then also, I think just having good soft skills, working in the MSP environment, you're working with all kinds of folks, different businesses, and then when you're working with small businesses, like you're working with their CEO, right? Like you're working with the person that runs the business every single day. So being able to handle different, pressures and uh, different understandings of technologies, and being able to make recommendations, tell them the hard facts sometimes. So it's like, hey, you could do it this way, but this is the way you should do it. So I think the work ethic, the trust, and the aptitude to learn is really what encouraged folks at that time of my career to take a shot on me, bring them in, and set me up for that position.
And those communication skills, is that something that you, obviously, sounds like similar experiences where I've had, like I said, talking about the help desk, but it's just you're getting better at it. Just the more you're doing it, just the more exposure, especially that wide range of exposure. It's not like you're dealing with the same, it is the same customers, but it's not the same type of customer. Like in gaming, if you're talking to food and beverage, like it's the same food and beverage, but it's like, okay, this is food and beverage, this is the casino pit. Like they all have their level of knowledge, of their expertise, like what they consider a priority versus what you do, right? Like if the casino pit is calling you about an issue or something like that versus, I don't want to diminish it, but let's say like housekeeping, like where's that priority level? Like, yes, that's on fire, that's more customer facing, there's a lot more potential for revenue impact, and understand that. Whereas, okay, sure, there's a housekeeping issue, like again, that's guests, but learning how to talk to them and say, hey, I get it, everything's on fire, and that you probably learned that just yourself. Like, okay, not everything is
Right.
is a catastrophe, but is it really just experience and just exposure to multiple things that you think makes you better at it? Or were you also at the same time like, okay, I need to get better at this through training or reading or whatever it is?
I think for me it's just exposure to different folks and different environments, and you know, it's definitely something I definitely need to work on it. It's not a skill that I think you ever perfect. You you only you're only exposed to what you're exposed to, and you never know what someone's gonna say. But as you get into different environments too, uh, there's norms, and there's there's SLAs, and then there's like, okay, you know what the real SLA is. And just, I think through experience and practice, that's kind of how I gained um, those communication skills, and so it's funny, like some rooms I can walk into and just, all right, start having a conversation, and then there's some rooms like, all right, I better sit back here and and you know make sure I present things a certain way, and I also think what really helps too is being able to break technology down. You know, not everyone needs the full, like, in the weeds resolution.
Right.
Sometimes they just need to know one or two things. Make them feel like they understand it. Make them feel like, oh yeah, I know this. I think that's something that's helped over the years with the communication. I think that's helped build some trust with different people I've worked with, and have trusted me to take responsibility on certain things.
So then now you're in the systems role, right? And you mentioned it, like for most people, they feel it's like that's the natural progression, right? Like if you start in PC support, you're either going to systems, you're going to networking, you're going somewhere there. Are you, now that you're in the systems role, did you have a plan of like, okay, I want to get towards like an architect level position, or is it more like I just want to be a really good systems person and I'll figure it out? Like some people have that progression, or at least what's one or two steps ahead, and there's others like myself that are just like, I need to figure this out first, and then I'll figure out maybe what the next step is when it gets to that point.
Yeah. So again, I was given another fire hose at a high velocity, and so I went from like,
right?
all right, I'm finally sysadmin, like, to like, oh man, what do I do? But no, I mean, I think I was so fresh into the position that I was like, all right, I'm here. I'm not gonna be sysadmin forever, but I like foreseeable future. This is where I want to be. And we were doing so many different projects. We were on the buying side of a merger this time, so I basically was, put into a domain migration, and on-prem email to cloud migration, and so I was learning a lot of different things. Again, kind of like talking about when you're in school, like you don't know what the real world is like, and you're like, oh, this is the real technical behind the scenes stuff in a merger I wasn't exactly exposed to. Like, we got to get everyone on the same email so they can look at the same Outlook address book, and we want to get off these on-premise Exchange servers and stuff like that. So I was in that position to kind of just start taking every single opportunity to learn, and I had to, like there was no, like, you needed to do this, like, or else you weren't going to stay afloat. So I was kind of in a position at that moment, like, all right, I'm going to be doing this for a couple of years, and I didn't even actually have like, at least from a 5-year outlook of like where I wanted to go next. And so that's where I was at that moment.
And that role, like you said, because you're doing all these different things, it probably, did you enjoy kind of that constant change and the constant learning? And is that, because it sounds like, just based on what you're saying, it's like, hey, that other desktop support role, like, hey, this is pretty easy. Is it, while it feels uncomfortable to have like this stream of knowledge, like, drinking out of this fire hose, and you're like, wait a minute, I thought this was a bigger one. Like, okay, there's different levels and there's different speeds to this, these types of roles and the types of information. But did you at the same time think, this is what I've been looking for. Like I want that next challenge.
Yeah, so that's exactly what I was enjoying the most, was just like, all right, I'm learning like some really advanced stuff. At least I thought it was at the time, you know. And I had some long days, but when I was looking at it, I was looking at like, all right, I don't know what's next after 5 years, you know, after I get tired of being a sysadmin, but I know this is going to really propel me um, into whatever that position is going to be. And, you know, in that role, I was able to, the best part, I think, even though I was a sysadmin, I was still interacting with people, especially as part of the domain migration. So I was part of the domain migration. I was having to travel to like our other office across the country, meet engineers who, you know, weren't exactly thrilled about their company being bought. You know, that's what I learned is like, with mergers, it's a sensitive situation for both sides. Like, and it's a really challenging process for people. And so when it comes to the technology, all I can do is try to make that transition easier for them, and as simple as possible. So at least when it comes to them being able to do their job, they don't have to worry about that. So in this domain migration, I was going across the country working with these folks and kind of getting to know their day to day, and you know, learning about different challenges they have, and so what really made me like thrive in that position. I think was all the technical stuff I was learning, but also just again talking about the communication and the people skills development there. Like that was something I didn't even think of when I was going into that sysadmin role. When I first took the role, you know, I was thinking, all right, you know, I'm gonna manage some storage, you know, make sure AD's replicating, backups, and like it really turned into more like a cross-functional position where you're kind of like what we talked about, why I wanted to go into information systems, is like you're interacting with the whole business, the whole picture, not just, you know, the screens and the ones and zeros and whatnot.
And if I remember correctly, around this time, it I think you also kind of stepped into like in a management role, or you know, it could be by title. You know, I've had one where it was a management role, but it was still very technical, like very hands-on. Like sure, there was a team underneath, and it sounds like you kind of enjoy like helping people, right? Like you understand that the human aspect of it, right? Like the communication skills. Is that was that kind of like a conscious choice? Did you think at some point like I want to try management and like I want to kind of be that kind of person, or is it more I don't want to say you were forced, but sometimes, you know, like you're promoted up just because you are, it seems like you do really well at your job, and they're like, hey, he can communicate, he has the technical skills, maybe we can do, you know, maybe he might thrive in this type of.
Yeah, so this was, I think, at the MSP before I jumped into sysadmin. But yeah, I was, this actually, you know, came out of my boss at this sysadmin job, for AGS. When she had left, my my boss at the MSP said, "Hey, you got to do her job now. I'm going to promote you to a network support manager," and that basically um, gave me the responsibility of kind of, instead of doing the technical work at the MSP, I was still doing the technical work, but also like, hey, you got to propose these solutions. You have to, you know, listen to them as a customer, you know, give them feedback on how things are going based on whatever services we're contracted to do. And that's something, you know, I never foresaw. Um, but also from a long-term perspective, you know, maybe the 10-year, 15-year plan, I'm like, hey, this is, you know, this might be where I want to be someday. Maybe while I didn't have direct reports underneath me, you know, I was kind of managing operations of a business initiative, you know, and so that was something that I enjoyed, and I think, you know, one of those things you put in your belt, you know, in terms of a tool, and from experience.
And even that experience, you think it helped, especially now kind of now remembering the timeline, the fact that that was early on, like, even though you weren't managing people, having that knowledge and that expertise, that probably, do you feel that that helped you later on, just having that, again, another, another tool in that tool belt to kind of go through and say, oh, I understand now. So when I managed, I also kind of got a little, call it like a peek behind the curtain. Like, you understand, like, how do we have to put budgets together. We have to know how all this operational stuff works. And one of the things that, similar to you, I was like, maybe I'm not ready. So my next role went back to an individual contributor, but it helped me understand. I think I became also a better employee at that point, right? Because I'm like, oh, I know what my manager's going through. So how can I be better at what I do to try and not be, like a burden or something extra that they have to think about?
Yeah, I think it helped me understand that, like, sometimes in our environments we're told like something just needs to happen, and you're like, why? This doesn't make any sense. Who made this decision? And then you realize, like, sometimes you don't always have the full picture. And, like, I think being in that role is like, okay, they want it to be this way and there's a reason. And so in my current role now, even though I have some influence, when something comes down the pipe and it's not my decision, I'm like, all right, someone someone has a good reason for this, and I, as the consultant, if you will, can say, hey, I think this is a bad idea because XYZ. Just want to let you know. And then you got to accept whatever comes out of that decision wise, And then also, I think it helps you be less frustrated.
So now you're in the sysadmin, you're gaining all this experience, and you're getting more challenges. And is it, what makes you kind of decide, hey, I want to kind of move into that next step? Is it really like, I've had these challenges here, maybe I'm not learning as much, maybe, again, you're not seeing the upward progression, which, again, is natural, right? Sometimes you do get to kind of move up, sometimes you got to move out, sometimes it sounds like, someone calls you out and says, hey, like, there's this thing over here, and makes you aware of it. So just from a career standpoint, I know that you're not looking at that 10-year plan, but at least, like a couple of years, and says, okay, what do I want to do next? And I'm going to kind of preface this a little bit, as you're doing a little bit of this systems work. And then when you told us earlier, it's more on the security side. So was there kind of a natural shift? Was it planned, or did it just kind of happen?
Yeah, so I was about 2 years into my sysadmin role at AGS at the time, and domain migration was kind of winding down. Kind of starting to unify as a company, and stabilizing. There's been some changes internally, and I got a new boss, and I was happy. I wasn't planning on leaving, but then one day I got a LinkedIn connection request from a recruiter, and over the years, I'd get those every now and then, and usually they were for roles I would take on earlier in my career, not at that time. It just wasn't a good fit, or for whatever reason. And this one piqued my interest, and so they said the right words in the connection request, and I was like, all right, I'll listen about this. I'm pretty happy where I am.
And when you mention the right words, and again, you don't have to get into details, but is it more the right words of like, hey, this is a challenge, or it's, hey, those are skills I want to pick up? Again, you don't have to go into detail, but just from a general standpoint, like, what is it that piqued your interest? Because I've had those, and sometimes it's just, oh, this skill set. I'm like, oh, I don't have that. Maybe I'll give that a try.
So for me, it was more of an organization interest. So they mentioned sysadmin, so I'm thinking lateral move, right? Like, okay, this got to be great if I want to move laterally. But they mentioned, a sports organization from the Bay Area, and it had just been a couple months after the Raiders announced they were going to move here. And I'm thinking, like, okay, well, there's no way this is the Raiders. Like, it's 2017. Like, they don't they're not going to play football here till 2020, but okay, I'll I'll learn more about it. And they sent me the job description, and some of it was stuff, even it was sysadmin title wise, but some of the stuff I wasn't like completely sure I didn't have familiarity with. Like, okay, you're going to support a POS system, you're going to support some e-commerce efforts, retail stores, and then there's going to be a sales office, but she's a sports organization, and you know you and I have talked about, like, I love sports,
Yeah.
and I kind of had something in me from my uncle when I was in college. Like, my uncle worked in horse racing, and he's a huge sports fan, but he was really into horse racing, and he made a career out of working in PR and horse racing, and like, he knew he wanted to be a journalist, but he also knew he wanted to be in the sports industry, so he found a way to like tie the two. So in my mind, as I was graduating UNLV, I was like, it'd be cool to get a job in sports someday. I threw in some applications as I was on my way out. Nothing really came of it. I got an interview with somewhere, but nothing really came out of it. And I just kept on with my career, kept the progression going. I wanted to work in technology. That was the main thing. So I didn't care if it was gaming, I don't, an MSP, travel site. Didn't care. Like, I won't, that was the main goal at that point in my career. So at this point, I'm like, all right, well, I've made some progress in my career. Man, it'd be cool to work for a sports team, like if this is the right fit, this could be it. This could be awesome. And so she screened me, didn't tell me who it was right away until she screened me and decided it was a good enough fit to pass up. It's like, okay, well, this position's with the Raiders. Are you still interested? I'm like, yeah, absolutely. So, but at the same time, though, where I was at with my current job, I was like, I'm in a good spot. Like, do domain migrations. We have offices all around the country. I got to travel to Mexico City, got to go to Atlanta. Got to do some travel, and I had my hands in a lot of systems and responsibilities that just 2 years prior didn't think I would have for a long time. So I was like, kind of still a little hesitant about it, but I was like, I'm gonna interview and I'm gonna see what this is about. And a couple interviews later, I'm leaving that job to go work for the 2B Las Vegas Raiders.
And I want to ask a little bit more about that, about kind of weighing the options, right? Because sure, it's one thing to say, hey, I work for a sports organization or work for X company. Sometimes, again, a name does influence, or maybe an industry, but you talked about it, right? Like, hey, I got to travel. You were touching technologies that 2 years prior, which is, yes, technology changes quick, but obviously at the same time, you're building up the reputation as somebody that can handle that, or kind of take on these challenges. I think a lot of times people, and I've done it, or I've made a move for money, or I've made a move, you talked about, like, hey, shooting your shot, and sometimes people might not shoot that shot just because, like, well, it's so good here, and it's, you hear all those things like, hey, sometimes it's not always better at, somewhere else. Like, yes, maybe I don't like this thing here, but going over there, it may be better at first, but then in the long run, you might be like, I should have stayed, right? So kind of at that time, how did you come up with the decision to say, like, okay, I still can grow here. Like, I'm a sysadmin. I could probably move up to an architect level here, or I can do other things. It's a big national corporation, right? Like, you're traveling places. Maybe you can even relocate and say, oh, I can go work for another building. How did you weigh that decision? And the reason I bring that up is because I want people to understand that, it doesn't matter at what point in your career, like, you have those decisions. There's benefits. It's not always money. It's not always the role. It's what did you evaluate?
Yeah. So for me, I was trying to look at, okay, what would be my growth path at this next job if I got it. And that's even something I brought up in the interview because, you know, you're just not knowing what an internal operations of a sports team was like. You're like, am I, just fixing printers and computers all day, or am I actually like, what are the inner workings and responsibilities, and what's your 5-year plan for me? Where could I end up? So I had to make sure when I was interviewing, I asked those questions and really understood what I could grow into, because at the time of when they approached me for the job, I was going to go from running corporate systems, being one of the main admins for it, to like, all right, we're got a preview center, we got some retail stores, we got e-com, and I was getting a lot of good experience. It was a great experience, but I just didn't know. I was like, I'm giving up a lot of responsibility, kind of going back into some of the stuff that I was doing at the MSP, which was valuable stuff, but it wasn't always the most. It wasn't the stuff that popped out on a resume, right? So I wanted to make sure that I was going to a position that I wasn't gonna maybe 6 months, a year, call back the prior employer and be like, hey, I'm kind of bored here. I'm kind of tapped out. So that was like number one for me. It was progression. I was getting paid good at my last job, so I wasn't hurting for money. I had no idea what the salary expectations were for this job yet because it was so early on. And I kind of wanted to figure it out before I jumped in the interviews, because the fact that they sent a recruiter after me meant like they were trying to be picky about who they were hiring. So I was like, all right, I don't want to waste anybody's time. I want to get this right. And so for me, it was definitely about, at that moment, career progression in terms of 5 years, and was I going to continue skilling up and not get stale with whatever I was working on.
And that interviewing them, right? Because I think a lot of times people forget, especially early on in your career. I'm guessing if you're anything like me, you're just, when they ask you like, do you have any questions, or, stuff like that, you're like, no, this sounds great, right? Because you think that it's just them interviewing you, but over time, did you just get better at understanding those types of, and asking those types of questions?
Yeah. So through the years of the different jobs I had after college, I learned like it's not good to not have any questions. Like that's a huge red flag, right? Not a huge one. I mean, depends on who's interviewing, but you want to show interest in also show that you're thinking about how you would fit in, and you're communicating, what the expectations are from your end are, and making sure they line up with theirs. So yeah, luckily by the time I had gotten that interview, I'd had that experience, and I made sure I asked those questions going in, like, what do you see this job being in 5 years? Is this job going to go away when the team gets here? Like that was another concern I had, because I just, you didn't know. I didn't know the inner workings of the sports team. And so yeah, I made sure I prepared for that, and made sure I had all the answers to my questions. So if an offer materialized and I was going to give up what I had at my current job, because again, this was just all happenstance. I was not looking at that time. I wanted to make sure I knew what I was going to give up, and what I was going to get in return if I left.
So then you get into this role, and I'm pretty sure, like you mentioned, it might have seemed a little bit at the time like you're kind of taking a step back, but based on kind of their answers, you knew that, okay, there's going to be a progression, right? It's just, how long is that going to take? What's that look like? But it happened, right? You start to progress your career, and then what leads you towards kind of your current role now?
Yeah. So early on, it was all about hey, we got these temporary offices here in Las Vegas. We got to get them up. We're going to have a sales center. We're going to have a call center. We're going to have these retail stores. And that was actually way more experience than I thought it was going to be. Like I was completely wrong. Setting up, I set up, store networks for retail stores, like our first 3 or 4 of them here, from getting the internet connectivity set up to working with a low voltage contractor, something I'd never done before, getting the equipment on the wall, getting our POS set up. That was a whole lot of experience I had a whole new appreciation for. And then just, as they started moving things out here, you know, getting my hands in the more traditional corporate technologies like Active Directory, Office 365. So from that point on to the point that the team got here, I started getting more acclimated with the entire organization, and then eventually football team arrives and getting some exposure to the football side. And so over those years, I basically, I've been there like 9 years now, but I think by 2020 was 3 or 4 years. I'd become very familiar with the environment, and I started gaining the trust of my boss in terms of like making sure we do things securely, and making sure we're not always taking the easy way out when it comes to like last minute issues, asking the right questions at the right time, like, hey, we could put this in the cloud, but is that the best place for it given what we need to protect, or should this be left unattended in this area, stuff like that. So eventually a need came up for a dedicated security person, not outside of IT, but still in IT, but basically a person who is at the table when we're talking about new IT initiatives and going, okay, how are we going to make sure this is compliant with XYZ? Is this the right way to do this? Is this the most secure way? And kind of being that check. And that's kind of how I got into the role I am now. And again, another opportunity of, I think, me building trust through hard work, asking questions, uh, building knowledge of the environment, and that, I think, is what kind of led me into my current role in being a security architect.
Looking back at it now, all this different exposure you had to different areas, and even when you get into this organization, the fact that you were doing a lot of this kind of from the ground up, right? Again, it's more exposure, so I think one, it's got to be pretty cool to set something up from the ground up, right? Because now you've been there from the get-go to kind of understand that, but also get that exposure. Do you think over time, like you said, sure, it's building the trust, but asking those questions and understanding, like, hey, I've been through a merger and acquisition, I've been through kind of all these different things, is that's what's helped you to ask those better questions and even know what questions to ask? Because now it takes time, right? And it takes experience, but it sounds like you've had exposure to a lot more different things, in smaller bursts, I should say. And then is that kind of what leads you to kind of that role? Like, you've gained the trust to be able to ask those questions where she was like, hey, we need somebody with a seat at the table, and you're thinking of these things because, hey, should we leave this unattended? Because I know that I worked at this coffee shop, and when they did that, granted it was a small coffee shop, here's what could have happened. But just kind of pulling back on those experiences. Now here's like, well, if we leave this unattended, it's not a small coffee shop. It is a big stadium, or, even the retail store, like the amount of people that flow through there is this, and here's a potential risk.
Yeah, I think having those different exposures definitely helps. And sometimes there's probably things I've learned after the fact, unfortunately, because something happened. But yeah, I think as I've had to interact with different things and different perspectives, like, that motivates me to ask questions and try to think about the what ifs, and sometimes be the annoying person, like why are we even worried about this? I'm like, right, I've seen it happen, or I read about it, or didn't think about it one time and then it happened, and so yeah, I definitely think that for sure.
And you mentioned reading about it. So is that something that you, especially in this role and even prior, like, is that something that your current knowledge, and I know we talked about a lot of things, and it's one of the things that I wanted to ask you is like, how are you building up knowledge outside of work? Because it sounded like, you talked about other areas, and I don't remember if it came up in a conversation, if, certifications, or it's just kind of reading and being aware of kind of other technology, even if you're not using it, but just kind of being aware. So like, how do you stay up to date and kind of gather that knowledge?
So I definitely rely on the internet a lot. I try to read a little bit of Reddit every day. I know that sounds super simple and not sophisticated, but there's so much. And there's hundreds of technology subreddits, depending on what focus you want to go on. But I try to go on the cybersecurity one every day, see what people are talking about. LinkedIn, obviously, you build your network of people that have like-minded interests, and you see things on there. So I'm constantly just going out there trying to read, trying to listen to some podcasts here and there too, the news, and then trying to just stay up on things. And then luckily in my position, a lot of things fall in my lap. AI, right? Like everyone's into AI. Everyone's heard of it. Everyone's talking about it. So I kind of get pushed in a direction like, hey, I better go figure this out. Like, so when someone comes to my office and says, hey, what do you think about this? Should we turn this on? Like, I kind of have some idea of it, and so I can start asking myself, okay, what should I care about here? What are the risks? What are things we got to worry about? But I'm huge proponent of just going out there and trying to stay up on things, even if it's a few minutes a day. And yeah, that's, and then talking to people too, like you and different people in my network.
So I know that we touched on a lot, and I mean, it's, you mentioned at the beginning, right? Like some of the things that kind of looking back, like being able to kind of take that shot, but then also, I think understanding that taking those calculated shots, right? Something that you over time have kind of learned, like, hey, I got to ask these questions. Like, sure, I'm going to go through and apply for it, and if I get the chance, like, okay, one thing is shoot the shot and say, all right, let me stretch myself. But then once you get that opportunity, is okay, now I have to start being a little bit more calculated. I can't just, throw a bunch of balls up and say, like, well, one of these is going to land, right? Like, I'd say, okay, well, hold on, like, I need to put myself in a position to be able to do that. Is there anything throughout your career as part of the conversation that you think either we missed or we kind of glossed over that, you think is important, or something that you want to talk about, or just kind of summarize your career?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's helped me in my career is, trying to learn everywhere you are, trying to make the most of it, and really gauging, whether you are learning and growing, because that I think that's really what makes your career trajectory. If you're doing the same thing every day, and you're not really learning, your skills become stale. You probably get bored, maybe get grumpy, and it depends where everyone's at in their career, right? Everyone's a different place, different career. You look at career opportunities differently given your personal situation, your life situation. But I think the biggest thing that's the most important is learning, and that's something I always try to hammer on when I talk to some mentees I have, is like, you got to start somewhere, and if you start somewhere that's lower than you want to be, ask yourself, are you learning? Obviously make sure you can pay your bills, and you're getting paid what you're worth, but also early on in your career, like, you can afford to stretch yourself a little bit and and take a role on that's gonna kind of like a long-term investment for your career, if you will, and pay dividends down the road for you. And maybe you're sitting in the chair and you're like, oh yeah, I'm glad I went through that. I never thought that would have impacted me today, but it did. And that's kind of my big thing, is making sure you're learning.
I'm glad you touched on two things. Is one, the constant learning, and two is just it can pay dividends in the long end, right? In the long run, because I think a lot of times, and one of the reasons that I tried to bring up, bring different guests is, okay, there's different experiences, but I don't think I've talked to any person here that said, hey, I came out, or after my first role, like I jumped from that to like the lead architect, or I jumped from here, and just exposing to people like, hey, it's a journey. It's good to have a plan, and think of where you want to go, but just know that as long as you're taking those daily steps, like, hey, am I constantly learning? Am I doing the things that are going to get me there, to where I don't think people realize it, but it will happen more often than not. If you're putting that story together, like you said, on LinkedIn or your resume, wherever, eventually those dividends are, recruiters are now going to come to you and say, hey, we want you from this pool because we see that you've built this skill set up over 10 years or 12 years, whatever that is.
And I also add to that too, is like, if you start at a lower position than you think you are, sometimes you might develop some imposter syndrome, because like, well, I couldn't start at that position before because I wasn't sure. Like, at some point when an opportunity comes along and you think you got enough, even if it's a little bit, if you think it's enough, you can cover like half the bullet points on the description, or some of the key things, like, go for it. If you're ready, you can't hold yourself back. Sometimes you have to make that jump on your own. So
I like that. I don't think anybody's really brought that up, is that could be how imposter syndrome kind of develops. Like, oh, why I didn't get that. I got this lower one. Well, maybe this is where I am supposed to be. But once you get there, like, you'll grow into it, right? As long as you're constantly learning, you'll get there, right? Like, no one, again, I don't think anybody comes out of college and was like, cool, I'm ready to run, a multinational organization, even though you think you are,
right.
But that's not the case.
And then you just never know where that work's going to bring you.
Well, I appreciate you kind of coming in and sharing your career and just kind of your experiences and the things that, have kind of worked for you. And, along the way, there's things that probably didn't, but hopefully, just kind of exposing people to, like, hey, there's multiple ways to get there, and this is what worked for you. And again, nobody's going to be able to follow your path exactly, but hopefully there's bits and pieces that they can say, let me try this. And, Andrew mentioned that, like, that could work.
I'm definitely glad I can come here and share my story.
And for everyone that's watching and listening, again, thank you for taking the time. And, hopefully you're finding as much value out of all these conversations as I am, because even though I've been in the industry for a while, like, as Andrew was telling his story, there's things in there that I had learned. I was like, oh, it's a different perspective, right? Am I going to always go and implement what he said? No, but it will help me think differently and adapt that to something that will work for me. So with that, continue to plug in and download the knowledge. And until next time, thank you.